Here's an animated overview of Data Cloud. The most important step is the planning stage. And we don't talk a whole lot about that in Trailhead or in a lot of the other training materials which focus on implementation. But they do mention frequently that planning is very, very important. You have to identify who's going to be involved in knowing where the data sources are, which are the best data sources, what data needs to be brought in, and also on the other end, what is this data going to be used for? How is it going to be activated and put to use? So identifying the stakeholders, identifying the sources of data, figuring out what is going to be done with all of this. And because Data Cloud is a consumption-based model, you pay for what you use. So it's very important to plan and calculate how many different kinds of things will you be doing, how often, and how much data, and how much is all of that going to cost. Once you've done all of that planning, you can get started with provisioning Data Cloud and setting up Data Cloud. Then bringing in the data from all the different sources, which involves connecting to the sources and then bringing it in, or possibly not bringing it in, but just pointing to or federating an external data source. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Next is to harmonize the data, and we'll talk a lot about this term harmonize. We have lots of different tools for examining the data that we've brought in and the harmonizing that we've done. And then finally, we take action after having done all this work. The whole point is to be able to act on the data and the insights and the segmentation that we've been able to do in all of these earlier steps. The whole point of all of that is probably to be able to take action. So now let's look at each of these phases of implementation and see what's involved at each phase. So starting with provision and setup, there's the question of which Salesforce org Data Cloud is to be provisioned in. It may be provisioned in your one and only Salesforce org that you already use, or for some organizations it may make more sense to provision a brand new Salesforce org just for Data Cloud. And then there's the question of data spaces. You get one data space by default. If you need additional data spaces so that you can separate which data comes in and who gets to work with that data, and who gets to work with it is determined by permission sets, then you might need to provision additional data spaces. And then you need to set up your users and apply your permission sets so that the right users can do the right activities, which we are going to talk about in the next columns. So that would be provision and setup of Data Cloud. And then the next step would be to bring in and or connect to the data. So the first step there is to do the connecting to the data sources, putting in the credentials so that you can be logged in to those external sources and access the data. And then ingesting the data, and this is where we start to see these special objects. The data source object, or DSO, is a temporary storage place when you first start ingesting data, and then it goes into these data lake objects, or DLOs. And it's important to understand that even though we are navigating Data Cloud from within Salesforce, the data in these data lake objects that you are ingesting into Data Cloud doesn't live in the same place where CRM data lives. It lives externally in a data lake. That's why we have this little lake symbol here. And also it's important to know that data can be brought in either in batches or streaming. Now this other option, which I mentioned earlier, is rather than ingest the data and have it taking up space in a data lake object, if it's already in a data lake that you can connect to, then you can do what they call bring your own lake, or zero ETL. ETL is extract, transform, and load. So rather than bringing it into Data Cloud, you do this other step of federating the data instead of ingesting the data, and that's an option. And then we can do some transformations, and we have 3 different tools for transforming. We can do row-level transforms with formula fields. We can also do batch transforms, and there's a graphical user interface to set up those batch transforms. Or we could do a streaming transform, which is more of a SQL query. So now we've provisioned Data Cloud, we've set it up for our users, we've connected to the data sources, and we've started bringing the data in or pointing to the data that we're going to work with and doing some transforms. So our next stage is to harmonize the data, and we're harmonizing it to a data model that comes with Data Cloud, but that we can also customize. That specific step is often referred to as the harmonizing step. But what I've also come to understand is that there are several other steps after harmonizing that are sort of in a category altogether called harmonizing. And we will see that even though this first step is mapping fields from the data lake objects to the data model object, so that's harmonizing. But really all of these additional stages create new things that are stored in these data model objects. So altogether, we're not just harmonizing at this stage, but as we go along, we continue to populate the data model. And so all of that might be considered to be harmonizing. So after we map the fields, then we go on to the next stage, which has several names. We call it unification or identity resolution, and the result of it is creating these unified profiles. And the tools that we use to do all of this are called rule sets, which are made up of 2 parts, the match rules and the reconciliation rules. And this can be done on both individuals and on accounts. And as you start to learn about Data Cloud, a lot of it talks about doing all of this on the individual, but it is also possible to do it at the account level. And then the next thing we can do is calculated insights or streaming insights. So calculated insights can do complex calculations, and they have what are called dimensions and measures. So if you're familiar with Salesforce reports, and you know that we can group rows, then those grouped rows, the values that we group on, another way to call that is dimensions. So it's basically, how do you want the rows to be grouped? And then measures would be like calculations in a report. So give me the sum or the average of all of these records based on this value in this field. Those would be like calculated insights, as opposed to streaming insights, which says this data is streaming in, tell me when a particular event happens. Like, for example, what looks like a fraudulent credit card transaction could be an example of a streaming insight that you would want to take action on right away. And then we have segmentation. We can say, having brought in all of this data, mapping it to the data model, unifying the profiles, and creating these calculations, can we now specify the different segments of these profiles that we want to target for example, marketing or other actions? We do segmentation in Salesforce all the time, but here we're acting on many other sources of data that have all been harmonized together so that we can segment based on all of that data. And we'll see this pop up again later when we want to act on that segment. So moving on to the next column, we have all these tools in Data Cloud to examine the data. There's a Data Explorer, a Profile Explorer. We can do reports and dashboards, and there is a Query API if you want to use that to query the results of all of this. And then finally, we're going to take action. So we need to specify an activation target where are we activating this data to, and we can take those segments that we created earlier and activate them to the target, for example, to Marketing Cloud or to an ad site or to CRM Analytics or to Tableau, just to give a few examples. Or we can do a different kind of activation, which is called data action. We have to specify the target, where is this going to, and then we can take a data action, which could make use of the calculated insights or the streaming insights to say, oh, something has happened, and we can send it to a webhook, we can send it to Marketing Cloud Engagement, or we can send it to Salesforce CRM and kick off a flow to make something happen. So for example, if a customer posts several questions about a product, maybe we could go ahead and create a case for them as an example of a non-marketing use case where the streaming data coming in and the streaming insight lets us know that we need to take some action in Salesforce, which could kick off a flow, as an example, to create a case and alert someone so that we can follow up. And then there's a thing called data share, which again is bring your own lake, which means maybe instead of activating to one of these kinds of targets, we are just going to share that back out to an existing data lake. And finally, we need to honor any requests to be forgotten. And there is a consent API that lets us do that. So anytime a customer says, I no longer want to be getting targeted in this way, we need to remove them from the system. And so we send a request to the consent API, and it at 30, 60, and 90 days attempts to get them out of the system so that they are no longer targeted. And that brings us to the end of this, and I'll just bring everything back so we can take a look at it in total. One topic that's not covered here is the idea of structured data versus unstructured data. And Data Cloud does have the capability to manage unstructured data, for example, videos or photos or files, as opposed to structured data, which is more like rows and columns of fields and values. I hope that's helpful.